On Easter night 2014, a beloved pastor and his entire family vanished from their Tennessee home without a trace. For years, no signs, no demands, just silence. Then a photo taken at a retirement home 10 years later sparked a chilling realization: one of them had been hiding in plain sight. What followed was a trail of secrets, betrayal, and a truth no one was ready to face. It was a bright Monday morning in April, the kind that made the white picket fences in Maple Cross look even more like postcards. Birds chirped outside as early rays of sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the small Baptist church on Ashbury Lane. The congregation began to gather slowly, expecting their usual post-Easter Monday gathering for coffee, leftover casseroles, and prayer. But something fell off. By 9 a.m. the church doors remained locked, and no lights were on inside the parsonage next door where Pastor Greg Miller and his family lived. The blinds were still drawn. Mrs. Esther Bloom, a longtime parishioner and one of the few who dared speak her mind around Pastor Greg, knocked politely on the front door. Then again, louder. When no one answered, she hesitated, then twisted the brass doorknob. It turned easily. The door creaked open. Inside, the house smelled faintly of maple syrup and coffee, as if breakfast had just been served. The dining room was set, plates half full, mugs still steaming, forks mid-motion, as if someone had simply stepped away for a moment. Pastor Greg's favorite maroon cardigan still hung on the back of his chair. His wife Melissa's reading glasses lay beside an open Bible on the counter. Esther called out, "Greg? Melissa? Emily?" No reply. Her voice echoed strangely in the stillness. She stepped back, her heart pounding, and pulled out her phone to call Sheriff Alan Granger. When deputies arrived 20 minutes later, they searched the modest two-story home thoroughly. No signs of forced entry, no blood, no broken windows, just nothing. It was as if the Miller family had evaporated. Upstairs, drawers were open, some half-packed suitcases lay beside the beds, as if someone had started to leave and then didn't. On the foyer table was a stack of Easter cards. Among them, one still sealed in its envelope, stood out. It was addressed simply, "Pastor Greg, for your eyes only." The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar. Deputy Clara Rivera, while logging the contents of the house, peeled it open carefully. Inside was a simple Hallmark-style card with a lamb and cross. But the message scrawled across the card's interior was anything but comforting. "I know the truth. Stop preaching, or I'll stop you." No signature. By the afternoon, yellow tape circled the property, and the entire town buzzed with whispers. Some believed it was a kidnapping. Others insisted the family fled in fear. Pastor Greg had recently spoken out in sermons about light exposing darkness. Had he uncovered something he shouldn't have? Melissa's sister, who lived 2 states over, but chalked it up to the holiday rush. The couple's teenage daughter, Emily, hadn't shown up for school that morning, and no one had seen her since the Easter Sunday service the day before. That service now felt eerie in hindsight. Parishioners recalled Greg seemed more reserved than usual, distracted. He had cut his sermon short, quoting Matthew 10:26. "There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known." And then he closed his Bible and dismissed the crowd without further word. By nightfall, the news reached local TV. Small-town pastor and family mysteriously disappear after Easter service flashed across screens. Authorities found no evidence of struggle, but the house radiated an unnerving calm, like time had been frozen. One detective remarked it felt like walking into a dream someone had just woken up from. Meanwhile, a neighbor reported hearing something strange around midnight Sunday, the sound of a vehicle door slamming, followed by footsteps on gravel, then silence. He assumed it was just the Miller family leaving early for a trip, but no suitcases were taken, and their car was still in the garage. The lack of digital clues frustrated investigators. No pings from phones, no security cameras on their block, and oddly, their home internet had been unplugged, but not by accident. The router was removed entirely. The congregation held a prayer vigil that night. Candles flickered on the church steps. Children clutched photos of Emily. But the atmosphere was more than grief. It was confusion, unease, as if everyone present had suddenly realized how little they actually knew about the people who led them in faith. By Tuesday morning, National media started circling. Pastor Greg had no criminal record, but someone dug up a 10-year-old article where he testified against a former church leader in another state. The article mentioned threats, even a police escort for a time. Could that old enemy have returned? Sheriff Granger, a veteran with a calm voice and tired eyes, faced the cameras. "We are treating this as a missing persons case. We urge anyone with information, to no matter how small, to come forward." But even he looked like a man grappling with the impossible. How could 3 people disappear from a fully intact house, mid-breakfast, leaving no trace but a threat scrawled inside a greeting card? 2 days into the investigation, Sheriff Granger returned to the Miller residence with a small team and a signed warrant. The initial walkthrough had turned up no overt signs of foul play, but the unsettling nature of the disappearance warranted a deeper look. Detective Carla Jennings led the second sweep, her gloved hands methodically opening drawers, inspecting photo frames, lifting couch cushions. She moved like someone used to disappointment, but still hopeful for overlooked truth. In Pastor Greg's study, a narrow room at the back of the house with walls lined by theology books and old sermon tapes, Carla opened the lower cabinet of a locked credenza, using a filed-down collate screwdriver. Inside, she found 2 brown accordion folders labeled Financial, Ministry, until she opened the first one. A spreadsheet printed on yellowed paper detailed the past 5 years of community donations to the church's building fund, but with several entries blacked out in thick marker. Curious, Carla flipped to the back and found loose pages, handwritten ledgers, each dated in Pastor Greg's but the totals didn't match the official church records. One entry in particular stood out, a $12,000 0-cent donation marked for roof repairs from a long-time elderly member, yet church maintenance reports listed no such repairs. She called in Granger. "This wasn't embezzlement for yachts or Rolexes," she said, flipping through more entries. "But someone was moving money quietly and not through proper channels." Granger frowned, arms crossed. "Greg was the only one handling church finances since the last treasurer moved last year." Carol nodded. "That's either a trust thing or a cover." They logged and bagged the documents, though without a victim, no charges could be filed yet. Word traveled fast in Maple Cross. By Wednesday, rumors swirled beyond the disappearance itself. Accusations, suspicions. The local diner buzzed with whispers. "I always thought Greg looked tired lately," one man said over coffee. "Maybe he was running from something." "Or someone," his friend replied. "Don't forget that card said, 'Stop preaching.'" The town had never seen this kind of media presence. News vans lined Main Street. Satellite dishes bloomed like steel mushrooms beside church parking lots. Reporters pressed for details, cameras rolling, faces polished with makeup under glaring lights. Inside the investigation room, Carla pored over background checks. She discovered that years ago, Pastor Greg had reported minor vandalism to his home, key scratches on his car, a broken mailbox, filed but never pursued. Back then, he'd attributed it to bored teens. Now it looked different. Melissa Miller's digital footprint was thin. She had no active social media, few bank transactions beyond groceries and church donations. Carla traced one transaction, a bus ticket purchase on Easter Saturday, paid in cash, but logged with a store loyalty card. The destination, Shreveport, Louisiana. Carla drove to the local bus depot and pulled security footage. It was grainy, time-stamped 7:04 p.m. Easter night. A woman resembling Melissa sat alone on the bench, head bowed, clutching a crumpled tissue. She looked up briefly, revealing red-rimmed eyes and a familiar blue scarf. When Carla showed the photo to Marlon Hill, a longtime church volunteer and close friend of Melissa's, the older woman broke down. "I saw her," Marlene confessed between sobs. "Easter Sunday, after service. She was in her car outside the church parking lot, crying into the steering wheel. I thought she just needed a minute." Carla leaned forward. "Was she alone?" Marlene hesitated. "Yes. She had something in her lap, a bus ticket, I think." "I saw the yellow stub." "Why?" "Didn't you tell us this earlier?" Carla asked gently. Marlene shook her head, ashamed. "I thought she just needed space. They were under a lot of pressure, you know. Not just church stuff, there was tension. Greg didn't like how involved she got with the shelter, said she was too distracted, and Emily, their daughter, she wasn't exactly happy being the pastor's kid. The narrative was shifting. What looked like a sudden disappearance now resembled something longer in the making, a quiet unraveling, unseen beneath the routines of Sunday worship and potlucks. Carla returned to the station that night and called Shreveport PD. They checked bus terminal logs and surrounding cameras. No one matching Melissa's description had been picked up after arrival. No shelters recalled her. No ID matches. Another dead end. Meanwhile, Greg's banking activity revealed one final withdrawing, $3,000, 0 cents in cash from an ATM in a gas station near the interstate, Easter Sunday, 2:15 p.m. He wasn't alone. The camera caught a partial image, a man in a ball cap, turning slightly toward the camera as he handed over a folded envelope to someone waiting in the car. The license plate wasn't visible. The make of the vehicle, silver Toyota Camry, matched a dozen others in town. As leads trickled in, so did false alarms, tips from psychics, sightings from people confusing Greg with other men. But a pattern emerged in testimonies. Many congregants recalled Greg's final sermons, taking a darker tone. He spoke of betrayal, of truth hidden in plain sight. Carla, flipping through audio recordings of past services, froze at a line from 2 Sundays before the disappearance. Not everyone in God's house walks with God. Some plant seeds only to burn the field later. At the next town hall, Sheriff Granger spoke with tight restraint. "There is no evidence at this time of foul play," he said, "but we're exploring every angle." He didn't mention the finances, or the ticket, or the surveillance footage. He didn't mention that no one had come forward to claim the crumpled scarf left behind on the bus bench, now sealed in an evidence bag on Carla's desk. Outside, rain began to fall softly against the windshield of Carla's cruiser as she sat parked in front of the darkened Miller house. Her mind circled the same question again and again. If Melissa was trying to leave, was Greg helping her escape or hiding something else entirely? And where was Emily in all this? As summer crept into Maple Cross with the slow, sticky heaviness of humid southern air, the urgency around the Miller case evaporated like morning dew on hot pavement. The yellow crime scene tape that had once wrapped around the house came down quietly in early June. The news vans left the church parking lot one by one. National outlets, once breathless with speculation about kidnapping, cults, and conspiracy, found newer stories with clearer villains. There had been no ransom note, no body, no violent struggle, no screaming neighbors, and most importantly, no answers. The investigation into the Millers stalled, not with closure, but with indifference. The folders of evidence, photos, statements, bus tickets, camera stills, were neatly stored in labeled boxes and shelved in the county records room. The words "cold case" were never officially used, but the message was clear. The town had moved on. Sheriff Granger, tired and no longer optimistic, returned to his usual routine of dealing with noise complaints, stray livestock, and the occasional drunk driver. Detective Carla Jennings was reassigned to a broader narcotics initiative after the state funding for the Missing Persons Unit was cut back. The Miller house remained empty, its front yard slowly overtaken by weeds, the mailbox eventually duct-taped shut by a well-meaning neighbor. Inside the church, Pastor Greg's absence was initially met with sorrow and confusion, but weeks turned into months, and sorrow turned into silence. A temporary pastor from a nearby district filled in, then eventually accepted a permanent role. The new sermons avoided heavy topics, no more fiery calls for truth, just safe, feel-good messages. Congregation numbers dipped slightly, but no one asked too many questions. For most people in Maple Cross, the Miller family had become a story from a while back, a mysterious blip in an otherwise quiet town's history. Only a few continued to whisper in hushed tones when walking past the house, or when Greg's name popped up in archived church bulletins. One person who didn't let go was Ruthie Langford, Greg's older cousin from Virginia. She had always been close with Melissa, especially during their early years of marriage when money was tight and Greg was still completing seminary. Ruthie visited the town once in early August to see for herself. She found the house empty, shuttered but still eerily preserved, like a museum exhibit no one was allowed to touch. That evening she met with Carla Jennings at the sheriff's office after calling ahead. "There's something I remembered," she said slowly, fingers laced around a lukewarm coffee cup. "I didn't think it mattered before. Maybe it still doesn't." Carola, still carrying a quiet weight about the case despite being pulled from it, leaned forward. It was maybe 2 months before Easter, Ruthie said. I was talking to Emily on the phone. She was helping me pick out a birthday gift for Melissa, and out of nowhere she asked, "Ruthie, if my dad ever got arrested, do you think we'd have to move away? Like far away?" Carola blinked. "She said that exactly," Ruthie nodded. "I asked her what she meant, but she brushed it off, said it was just a joke, a weird question from school or something." Carola's pen stilled against her notepad. "Did you ever tell anyone about that before?" "No," Ruthie admitted. "I didn't want to make trouble. I thought maybe Greg had said something heavy at home, one of those long lectures he used to give when he was stressed. But now—" She trailed off. The next morning, Carol drove back to the church archives and requested access to past Sunday school records, youth group sign-in logs, anything with Emily's name. She found little, some attendance sheets, a few notes about volunteer hours. But one curious entry stood out. On a torn note attached to a clipboard, someone had written, "Emily asked again about safe houses." Someone needed to talk to her. It wasn't signed. The handwriting looked like a teenager's. Carla sat in her car afterward, staring out the window at the church steeple. Something deeper had been happening behind those walls. Not scandalous or dramatic enough for tabloids, but slow, private evaluation. What kind of home environment made a teenage girl repeatedly ask about escape plans? What exactly had Greg been preparing his family for? The Miller finances, though already combed through by forensics, were revisited quietly by Carla, using her personal login from home. She noticed one more odd detail. 3 months before the disappearances, Greg had made an anonymous donation to a nonprofit legal defense fund focused on clergy whistleblowers. The organization, based out of Colorado Springs, had no record of who sent it, but the handwriting on the check's memo line, "For them," matched Greg's. In mid-August, the church received a postcard from a tiny border town in New Mexico, addressed simply, "To the congregation." It contained no message, just a photograph of a desert landscape, flat, sun-baked roads stretching into nowhere, a faint silhouette of a motel in the distance. The return address was fake. Sheriff Granger dismissed it as a hoax. Carola wasn't so sure. Later that month, Ruth received a blank envelope in the mail at her Virginia home. No return name, just a single Polaroid inside, a blurry shot of a girl walking with her back to the camera, ponytail swinging, backpack slung low. It could have been anyone, but Ruthie swore with shaking hands that the backpack was the same one she'd gifted Emily the Christmas before. She turned the photo over. Nothing written, but under angled light, faint pencil impressions suggested a phrase had been erased. Carla took it to the lab herself, and under magnification, the words revealed themselves slowly. Not gone, just somewhere else. The problem was, somewhere else could be anywhere. 5 years had passed. The Miller case, once a burning mystery in the heart of Maple Cross, had long slipped into the realm of folklore, something murmured about at church potlucks or over gas station coffee, but never truly expected to resurface. Most believed the family had perished in some untraceable tragedy. The empty Miller house was eventually sold at auction and converted into a counseling center, run by the same denomination. New locals visited it. There were whispers it still felt cold. Detective Carla Jennings, now working in the larger district office in Clark County, kept a copy of the Miller file in her personal drawer, buried under newer cases but never discarded. Every now and then she glanced at it, wondering what pieces hadn't clicked, what eyes had missed. Then, one Friday morning, in late October, her office line rang. A priest from a shelter-based parish in Montgomery left a voicemail, his voice tentative but clear. "I had a young man come for confession last night. Mid-20s, tall, thin. He said something strange. Thought you'd want to know?" Carol called back immediately and arranged to drive down the next day. The shelter, called St. Mark's Haven, was a worn, overcrowded building wedged between a liquor store and a tire shop. Inside, the smell of bleach and old wood lingered. Father Doyle met her near the reception desk, clutching a worn Bible and a yellow notepad. "He came in late," Doyle began, walking Carla through the narrow hallway lined with bunk beds and donated coats. "Around 10:30 p.m., said he hadn't eaten in days. I offered soup, he said no. He only wanted to talk, claimed he'd been helped years ago by someone named Greg Miller." Carla's breath hitched. "He said the name?" Doyle nodded solemnly. He said, "The pastor who helped me get out, Greg Miller, he wasn't like the others. He didn't turn me in." Careless he'd then add, "He said he told me if anyone ever came looking to say thank you and nothing else." Carla asked to review shelter records, hoping to get a name or at least a paper trail. The intake log listed him as Zeke Allen, age 24, no ID, no last known address. The handwriting was tight and sharp, likely his own. In the comments section, the intake worker had written, talked about running from something, mentioned preacher from Tennessee and encampments. Carla asked to speak with the young man directly, but Doyle shook his head. He left at sunrise, didn't even take a blanket, vanished like he'd never been here. Frustrated but intrigued, Carla spent the next 2 days canvassing local homeless hangouts, soup kitchens, and encampments. She showed Zeke's shelter photo, a grainy security cam image, to dozens of people. A few recognized him, said he went by Z, but no one knew where he'd gone. One woman at a food line said she last saw him talking to a man in a white pickup truck behind the old train station. "Didn't look like trouble," she said, but he was real nervous. Kept checking his shoulder before his Sunday sermons, kept checking his shoulder, but he was real nervous. Kept checking his shoulder and cross-rephrasing mentions of Georgia. One city popped up 3 times in different contexts. Dalton, a small, quiet place, known more for carpet mills than controversy. Carla dug deeper. 2 months before his disappearance, Greg had attended a clergy conference in Dalton. On the final night, he skipped the closing ceremony. No explanation was ever given. Carla requested access to guest lists, event programs, anything that might show who he'd interacted with. Nothing jumped out until she came across the name of a retired deacon named Harold Banks, who ran a private shelter network for victims of trafficking. Banks had passed away the year prior, but his organization, Sanctuary Steps, still operated quietly. Carla called their office and asked if any of their former clients had used the name Zeke Allen. The receptionist hesitated, then transferred her to the director. "I can't confirm that name," the woman said cautiously, "but we did have a young man come through about 4 years ago who mentioned a pastor from Tennessee. He never stayed long, just passed through on his way to New Mexico." Carla's heart skipped. That same region had come up once before in the strange, unsigned desert postcard the Maple Cross congregation received years ago. The timeline matched. Could Zeke have been traveling along the same path the Millers once did? She requested surveillance access from regional bus terminals and began a digital trace, triangulating times, stops, and even gas purchases Greg had made on his last known day in town. But it was like chasing vapor. Zeke had spoken of safety, not fear. He had been helped, not harmed. And yet, he was running again. 3 days later, Carla got a call from the St. Mark's shelter. A blanket had turned up in the alley beside the building, folded and marked with a barely visible embroidered patch. MM35, a reference, perhaps, to Micah 3:5 or someone's initials. Carla had it sent to forensics, but the material was generic, untraceable. Zeke had left behind no fingerprints, no belongings, nothing else to tie him to anyone. And yet his words stuck like burrs. He helped me get out. From what? From whom? And why had Greg told him to stay silent? Carla began to suspect something she hadn't dared voice before. Not only had the Millers vanished deliberately, but Greg had continued helping others disappear. If that were true, then this wasn't a case of one missing family, but the quiet operation of someone shielding people from systems designed to fail them. But if Zeke was a loose thread, someone would be pulling at it soon. 3 weeks after the search for Zeke Allen had once again gone cold, Detective Carla Jennings sat at her desk, sorting through follow-ups she knew would likely lead nowhere. Her inbox had become a graveyard of dead-end tips, blurry sightings, false identifications, and copycat letters from conspiracy theorists obsessed with vanishing families. Still, she persisted. The Miller case had stopped being just a mystery for her. It had become something more personal, a test of persistence in the face of obscurity. On a quiet Tuesday morning, a standard Inter-SO envelope arrived at the station, unmarked except for her name in all caps. There was no return address, no postmark. Inside was a plain piece of white paper typed in Times New Roman font. "You stopped looking in the wrong direction. Try Colorado." Below the words was a single photograph, slightly curled at the corners. It showed a girl, maybe 13 or 14, standing in front of what looked like a rural pharmacy. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore a navy hoodie and faded jeans. Her face was angled slightly to the left, but even through the low resolution, Carla felt a jolt. The resemblance to Emily Miller was staggering. The eyes, the jawline, even the way she held her shoulders. It was like seeing a ghost that had aged. Carla scanned the photo for any identifying details. A weathered sign above the building read, Harvey's Pharmacy, and below it, barely visible, Est 1972, South Fork. She searched the town instantly. South Fork, Colorado, a population under 500. On Main Road, remote enough to hide in plain sight. She booked a flight that afternoon. The next day she drove into South Fork just before sunset. The mountains loomed in the distance, snow-capped and silent. The pharmacy sat near the corner of Main and Aspen, a squat beige building with peeling blue trim and a rusted metal sign swinging above the door. Inside, an elderly man with thin white hair stood behind the counter, wiping a pair of thick glasses. Carla introduced herself, showed her badge, and gently laid the photo on the counter. "Have you seen this girl before?" she asked. The man adjusted his glasses and leaned in, squinting. Then he exhaled sharply. "Well, I'll be damned. That picture, I printed that." Carla stiffened. "You remember her?" He nodded slowly. "Not her face exactly. I see a lot of tourists and families passing through every summer. But that background, that was my storefront. And that paper, it's from my old Canon printer. I used to offer photo prints back when people still cared about souvenirs," she pushed gently. "Do you remember when?" He thought for a moment. "Had to be 9 years ago, maybe more. I stopped doing prints shortly after my wife passed. I shut down that machine in 2015, gave it to the school. But that photo, it came from here." Carla asked if he had any record of the transaction, credit card, email, anything. He shook his head. "Cash only. Most folks didn't leave names. But wait." He disappeared into the back room and returned with a dusty receipt book. He flipped through yellowed pages until he landed on an entry labeled Print $4.75, out-of-state license plate. It was dated June 23, 2014. Carolyn took a photo of the receipt. "Do you remember the people who came in that day?" The man shook his head, apologetic. "Not much, but I remember the girl had freckles. Not too many, just enough. She was quiet. The man with her said she was camera shy. I told them she looked strong." He paused. "I thought they were just passing through." Carla spread the photo on the desk and stared at the girl's face under the dim yellow light. If the date was right, Emily would have been about 11 or 12. She compared it to school photos from the file. Same eyes, same smirk. It had to be her. But what was she doing in Colorado, almost a year after disappearing? And who had taken the photo? She called the postmaster in South Fork and asked about mail drop boxes, surveillance, anything that might explain how the envelope had found its way to her desk. Nothing. There were no security cameras around the post office, and no one remembered seeing anyone suspicious. The envelope had likely been mailed days ago, rerouted through Denver, and hand-labeled to avoid tracing. The next morning, Carla drove to the town's only school and asked to review yearbooks from the 2014-2016 period. The secretary was cooperative, though skeptical. Carla flipped through pages, hunting for any hint of Emily's features under a different name, but nothing stood out. No Emily, no similar-looking girls. Whoever had printed that photo hadn't enrolled her in school. Carla then visited the public library. In the guest book she found a scribbled name in shaky cursive coloring. The Melissa could have been Greg's counsel 2014. The G could have been Greg's wife's maiden name, or maybe it was misdirection. Either way, it was the first time in years Melissa's name had appeared in any traceable record. She cross-referenced local motel registries, but found no guests matching the Miller name or close variations around that time. A few entries had paid cash and left no ID. One, listed as Frank L., had stayed in a roadside cabin for 3 nights. Check-in June 21, 2014. The same weekend the photo was printed. Carla called the property manager. An old woman named Lydia answered, voice thick with cigarettes and suspicion. When Carla explained her inquiry, there was a long pause. Then Lydia said, "You know what? I do remember them. He was polite, paid in full, said he was showing his niece the mountains before heading west." "What did the girl look like?" Carla asked, pulse quickening. small, brown hair, always reading. She didn't talk much? Uda paused again. But the woman, she looked scared, not like scared of me, like she hadn't slept in days. Carla returned to her motel, heart racing, timeline forming. If Emily had been in South Fork in 2014, then the family hadn't vanished together, or at least hadn't stayed together. Someone had stayed together, someone had planned, but the bigger question remained, who sent the letter now? And why? The photograph from South Fork had stirred more than just memories. It had opened a new door, and Detective Carla Jennings was determined not to let it shut. Back in Clark County, she began cross-referencing nearby states for unusual patient reports, name changes, and sightings of women resembling Melissa Miller during the years following 2014. It was a long shot, but so was everything else in the Miller case. 3 weeks later, she received an unexpected voicemail from a nurse practitioner named Janice Madsen, working out of a private women's clinic in Santa Fe, New Mexico. "I saw a news clip about the missing pastor's family," Janice said, "and I think I treated his wife back in 2018. I can't say for sure, but she looked just like her." Carla called back immediately and arranged a visit. The clinic was modest, nestled between a bike shop and a bookstore, its brick facade cracked from desert heat. Inside, Janice met her with a wary expression, her badge already checked, her tone careful. Came in under the name Claire Gibson. Said she'd had a minor head injury, didn't remember where she was. No ID. She seemed frightened but polite. Confused, her memory was patchy, not completely gone, but scattered. She remembered her favorite color was green. She said she loved thunderstorms, and she mentioned someone named Emily more than once. Said she missed her. Carla felt a cold thread run down her spine. Did she mention a husband? Janice nodded. She said she'd been married once, but that he wasn't safe anymore. I didn't know what to make of that. Honestly, I thought she might have been fleeing abuse. She handed Carla a scanned file, basic intake notes, vitals, and a prescription for mild anti-anxiety medication. What caught Carla's attention was the prescription pad's bottom corner, a handwritten note in the prescribing doctor's writing, reading framed out to be pending the establishment, ID pending, but next to the patient's signature, faint but legible, were the words, Melissa Gentry. "Did anyone ever come to get her?" Carla asked. Janice shook her head. Left 2 days later, quietly. Told us she was taking a bus. We never saw her again. She left behind a paperback novel and a scarf. We didn't keep them? Carla sat back in the clinic's guest chair, trying to process. If Melissa had been in Santa Fe in 2018, that meant she had survived at least 4 years after the disappearance, had possibly been living under a new name, perhaps separated from Greg. But what had happened to her in those 4 years, and what had caused the memory problems? Back at the district office, Carla pulled Melissa's old high school records, hunting for any other use of the Gentry name. Then she looked for public bus station logs, shelters, and rental apartments tied to similar aliases. Nothing solid emerged, but she began to form a theory, one that felt more plausible with each fragmented detail. Melissa may have been the one trying to escape, not Greg, and she may have lost more than just her home. She contacted local police departments across New Mexico and Colorado, flagging the name Claire Gibson and requesting info on any Jane Does fitting Melissa's description. One match came back from a rural clinic north of Taos. No name, just a note from an ER nurse describing a quiet woman in her 40s with no ID, claiming to be looking for her daughter. The date? September 2018, 2 months after the Santa Fe visit. Carla followed the thread further. A nearby motel listed a Claire G. in its handwritten guest log, a note next to it reading, "Cash payment, 2 nights." The clerk, long retired, didn't remember the woman, but the room in question was beside the building's only window with a view of the local school playground. Carla reviewed traffic cameras, business surveillance, anything that might have captured movement near that area in 2018. Most had already been wiped, lost to time or upgraded systems. She was running out of ways to chase ghosts. Then, in a dusty cardboard box of archived pharmacy transactions, retrieved from a warehouse in Albuquerque, a receipt surfaced. It was for a refill of the same anti-anxiety medication prescribed at the Santa Fe clinic. The name was Claire Gentry. The signature looked like Melissa's, albeit shakier. Carol stared at the receipt for a long moment. The date was October 4, 2018, and the pickup location, a pharmacy just 5 blocks from an elementary school that shared its mascot, Timberwolves, with the same embroidered patch Carol had seen in the Polaroid found by Zeke's shelter. She reached out to the school district. No students named Emily Miller or Gentry had ever been registered, but one temporary substitute had applied that fall for a part-time cafeteria role. The name? Claire G. The application had no ID attached, and the applicant never showed up for orientation. Still, the handwriting matched the pharmacy signature. Carla stared at her growing map of names and dates. String and thumbtacks linking 3 states. If Melissa had moved through New Mexico in 2018 and possibly searched for Emily, that meant the family hadn't simply hidden together, they had fractured. Melissa had been alone, and she may have been trying to find her daughter just as Carla was. But if Melissa had fallen off the map again after 2018, what had stopped her? Was it fear, a mistake, or something worse? 3 months after tracing Melissa's fragmented trail across New Mexico, Carla Jennings found herself at a frustrating standstill. Each path she followed led only to echoes, half-names, receipts, and disappearing traces. She had tracked Melissa, suspected Emily's presence in South Fork, but Greg Miller remained the missing piece. Dead or alive, guilty or desperate, he was the figure around which everything else revolved, the man whose absence remained the loudest noise in the case. Carolyn knew better than to expect miracles, so when the miracle came, it didn't arrive in a manila envelope or a police report. It came in the form of a Facebook post tagged in a community Easter event photo by a volunteer from a nursing home 2 states away. She found it on a lazy Sunday evening, aimlessly scrolling through her phone while watching the news. The image was bright and cheerful, elderly residents seated in plastic chairs, pastel balloons and paper crosses decorating the background. But it wasn't the decorations that stopped Carla's breath. It was the face of a man near the center of the frame, seated, smiling, his eyes clouded with blindness, but unmistakably familiar. The jawline, though softer with age, the dimple on the left cheek, the crease between the brows. Greg Miller, or someone who could have been his twin. The photo had been uploaded by Emma J. Barlow, a local college student volunteering at the Pleasant Pines Retirement Center in northern Arizona. Carla immediately messaged her, polite but direct. Within 2 hours, Emma responded, surprised at a thrilled Barley-Q. "He's new," she typed. "Moved in about 6 weeks ago. They call him Frank. Real sweet guy. Always humming hymns." Carol requested the full name. Emma checked with the staff and replied, "Frank L. Martin." Carla's heart kicked. She had seen that name before. Frank L. was the alias used in the South Fork Motel guestbook in 2014, the same week the Emily look-alike was photographed. First thing Monday, Carla drove to Pleasant Pines. The front desk was polite but hesitant until she showed her credentials and quietly explained she was working on a historical investigation. With permission from the facility director, she met with the records coordinator. Frank L. Martin had been admitted in February 2023, transferred from a regional hospital with partial blindness and a weak heart. According to the documents, he'd been picked up by an unknown Good Samaritan and left at the hospital with only a note, "No next of kin. Needs rest. Please help." His medical intake listed his age as approximately 68. He gave no family details, no known address. When asked for his Social Security number, he replied that he didn't remember it. The number eventually assigned to him by the system was generic, and a background check revealed no digital records before 2015, no driver's license, tax history, or even insurance card. Carla asked to speak with him. The director agreed, under the condition it wouldn't be a formal interrogation. "He's gentle," she was warned, "and fragile, but very sharp when he wants to be." She found him in the community garden, seated on a blanket. His eyes were milky, fixed on a patch of sunlight he couldn't see. But he smiled as she approached. "You're not from around here," he said softly, before she could speak. "No, sir," Carla replied, kneeling gently beside him. "I'm Carla. I work in law enforcement. I wanted to ask about your name. They told me it's Frank," he said with a chuckle. "I believe them. Do you remember being called Greg?" she asked, watching him closely. His smile faltered just slightly. "Greg," Hazen said, "just now saving it for a long moment." Then, slowly, "I used to preach. Long time ago. Before the noise. Before we had to leave." Carla leaned in. "Why did you leave?" His face stiffened. "Because not all truth is safe to tell, and some ears weren't ready." "Did you have a wife?" "I remember her singing in the kitchen," he said, his voice distant. "She wore yellow when she was happiest. She liked basil." "I never did." "And a daughter. She had the sharpest eyes," he whispered. "Could see through people. That's what scared me most." "Where are they now?" "I don't know," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. "They left before I could finish." Carla didn't press further. She knew pushing might drive him inward. Instead, she asked if he remembered a town called South Fork. He smiled faintly. "Mountains, cold water, a camera shop on the corner." Later that afternoon, Carla requested a handwriting sample. The director allowed it. Frank wrote a Bible verse on a blank page. "There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed." It was shakier, looser, but unmistakably the same hand. She returned to her hotel with the sample, her head spinning. If this was Greg, he had been alive all along. He had not been running in fear, but hiding in silence. The man she found was no longer a preacher. He was a ghost learning to live with memory in pieces. But why had he chosen now, of all places, to surface? And who had delivered him to the hospital? And why had he, of all people, been left without any name but the same alias he'd used years ago when running with his family? News of the elderly man at Pleasant Pines, who bore a striking resemblance to the long-missing pastor, Greg Miller, had not yet reached national headlines, but within Maple Cross, word spread like wildfire. Former parishioners exchanged messages, old acquaintances forwarded screenshots of the Easter photo, and whispers once again filled the aisles of the church that had once belonged to him. One person who took the rumors seriously was Harold Brenner, a retired truck driver and one of Greg's oldest friends in the congregation, a man who had sat front row every Sunday for 8 years straight until the day the Miller family vanished. Harold made the 6-hour drive to Pleasant Pines on a bright Tuesday morning, parking in the lot with hands trembling slightly from age and anticipation. He had always believed Greg hadn't just disappeared but had chosen to vanish, and now, if this truly was Greg, he needed to look him in the eye one more time. Inside the facility, staff guided Harold to the courtyard, where Frank, still known publicly by that name, was sitting in his usual spot, humming quietly. The moment Harold approached, the humming stopped. Greg, or Frank, lifted his face slightly, as if he sensed the man standing before him. "Greg," Harold said quietly, voice hoarse, "is it really you?" The old man smiled without looking up. "You still carry your keys in your front pocket, don't you, Harold?" Chucked with emotion. "I forget a lot," Frank said softly, "but not the ones who never stop believing in second chances." Harold sat beside him, silent for a moment. Then, leaning closer, he asked, "What happened to them, Greg? Melissa? Emily?" Greg, or Frank, tensed. Then he whispered so low only Harold could hear, "They're safe. But don't bring them back here, please. Let them stay gone." Harold pulled back slightly, stunned. "But because here isn't safe," Frank replied. "Not for them, not for what they know." Meanwhile, Carla Jennings had already begun formal procedures to confirm identity. She had obtained a court-approved warrant for DNA comparison, swabbing Frank's saliva after the facility physician agreed it was in the interest of potential reuniting with family. The sample was rushed through analysis. Within 72 hours, the result came in, Frank L. Martin was genetically identical to Gregory Ethan Miller, born 1956, former pastor of Maple Cross Community Church. Carla stared at the report, unsurprised but still emotionally winded. She had known in her gut. The signature, the memories, the voice, it had all aligned. But DNA made it final. This was no look-alike or long-lost cousin. It was him. She ordered a secondary check, cross-referencing Frank's supposed records over the past 9 years. What emerged was stranger than expected. There were no tax filings, no driver's license renewals, no voter registration, no medical insurance claims. From 2014 until his appearance at the hospital in 2023, Greg Miller had been a legal ghost. No traceable activity under any known alias. The only fragment was that one motel registry in Colorado. Legally, he was not dead, but had existed outside the system so effectively that even the IRS had no record of his existence. Carla considered what that implied. Someone, perhaps Greg himself, had meticulously erased or sidestepped every legal footprint. And, more importantly, he had help. She returned to Pleasant Pines, this time not just as a visitor, but with formal documentation identifying Frank as Greg Miller. She sat beside him in the same courtyard. He was knitting, or at least trying to, with a tangle of yarn in his lap. "I have your DNA results," she said. He nodded, not looking at her. "You're Greg Miller. That's now confirmed." He set the yarn down. "It depends," she said carefully. "Where is your daughter?" He smiled faintly. "She's not a child anymore." "Your wife?" He was silent for a long moment. Then, "We had to split. It wasn't safe to stay together, not after what she learned." Carla leaned in. "What did she learn?" He shook his head slowly. "Something that can't be unlearned. It wasn't about the church. It was about what the church was built on. Who gave what? Who got what back?" "You mean the money?" "I mean the silence," he whispered. "The kind bought, borrowed, and buried. Is someone still after you?" "I don't know anymore," he said. "Maybe they've forgotten. Maybe they're still watching." Carla sat back, unsure what to make of his statements. But her gut told her this was no delusion. There was fear behind his words, a fear so deeply embedded that even with blindness and old age, he was still protecting something. The next morning, Carla received an anonymous envelope at her hotel. No return address. Inside was a flash drive. She opened it on a secure device. It contained scanned pages of a ledger, one she recognized from the original search of Greg's study, but with entries not found in the police evidence. Names, amount of side payments, and a final page, 2012-2013, Shelter Fund, discreet. The document was real, and whoever had sent it wanted Carla to know the story wasn't over. The walls of Pleasant Pines were beige and quiet, a place where time moved slowly and secrets were supposed to fade into forgetfulness. But for Greg Miller, now known as Frank L. Martin, silence had never meant surrender. Though his eyesight had failed him and his body had slowed, his mind had been working in silence, framing memories and lining them up like verses in an old sermon. The fear, the guilt, the decision to vanish, none of it had faded. So when he began to feel the shortness of breath creep in more frequently, and the doctor hinted that he might want to get his affairs in order, Greg decided it was time to unburden, not through confessions shouted into the void, but through ink pressed to paper. He had kept a small notebook tucked between the folds of an old hymnal, the leather cover softened by time. It had no title, no name, only a faint cross indented on the front from years of pressure. He gave it quietly to Marisol, the evening nurse aide, who always brought his evening tea without asking, who spoke little but listened fully. "I'm no longer here to talk." Merrill took it with a nod, not knowing what she held until 3 nights later when Frank suffered a minor stroke and was transferred to observation care. The next morning, the director of Pleasant Pines called Carla Jennings directly. "There's something you need to read," she said. Carla arrived within hours. In the director's office, she was handed the notebook, its pages filled with Greg's tight, deliberate script. Some entries were reflections. Others were raw memory. But midway through, Carla found what she hadn't known to look for, an account not of disappearances, but of decision. One passage read, "He came to my office 2 weeks before Easter, smiling like he was offering me something holy. He sat without being asked. Said the money had always kept the walls standing, that as long as I knew my place, my family would be safe. I asked what he meant. He said Melissa liked to take Emily to choir practice alone, and that little girls remember faces even when they grow up. I told him to leave. He told me to pray harder." That's when I knew we had to go. Another page listed dates. April 1st, meeting. April 2nd, verified bank ledger. April 5th, found second record book hidden in choir loft. April 2nd, contacted shelter number from bulletin board. April 8th, signed resignation letter. April 12th, Melissa burned papers. April 15th, asked why we couldn't say goodbye to Ruthie. Then a chilling entry. April 18th, we left before dawn. No note, no trace, just trust in God and a prepaid map. Carla flipped through more pages. One was written in different ink. The lines rushed, "He ran a network. Not just here. I found out too late. They paid silence, with vacations, loans, even health coverage. I tried to speak to the district board. The call was intercepted." After that, Melissa said she couldn't sleep near windows. There was a name, finally, though Greg never wrote it in full, just initials. DK, Carla searched old financial records of Maple Cross Community Church, pulling up the list of board trustees and financial donors from the years leading up to 2014. One name matched the initials, Douglas Kenton, a prominent businessman in the area, listed as lead donor and part-time youth program sponsor. Digging deeper, Carla found that Kenton's company, a construction firm, had contributed heavily to church expansions, and in return had received several zoning exemptions under Greg's tenure. She checked the old complaint box logs from the church archives. One anonymous envelope had been turned in just months before the Millers vanished, referencing inappropriate comments made by Mr. K to young volunteers. No follow-up was recorded. The implications were staggering. If Greg's notes were true, Kenton had operated more than just a financial influence. He had wielded threats, and possibly much worse. Greg's decision to disappear wasn't just fear, it was protection. Not for himself, but for Melissa and Emily. But the final pages of the notebook revealed something even heavier. An entry dated July 2020 read, "Melissa found me in Las Cruces. She had been living under Gentry again, working nights. She said Emily had grown cautious. Too cautious. We talked about going to authorities." But the ledger was gone. The second one. Without it, it's just our word, and our word's not enough when ghosts hold the keys. Then I told her to leave again, to take the girl and find the place we talked about, near the orchard, where no one listens for bells. Carla closed the notebook slowly, her hands tense. The orchard. Another place. Another coded clue. But one thing was now undeniable. Greg had fled not out of guilt, but out of purpose. And in doing so, he had sacrificed his identity, his safety, and likely the unity of his family. The next day, Carla submitted the notebook for forensic review. Experts confirmed the ink, paper, and handwriting were consistent with the timeline. The dates matched Greg's resignation and disappearance. The information about Kenton raised new questions, especially as public records showed Kenton had left the area in 2016 and moved to a private estate in Montana. But what stood out most was the quiet clarity of Greg's writing. He had never asked to be forgiven. He had only asked that someone, someday, believe him. The contents of Greg Miller's notebook, combined with the confirmed DNA results and whispered name of DK, had pushed the investigation into a new and dangerous territory. Carla Jennings, now surrounded by state investigators and a cautiously interested files tied to the Maple Cross Church, specifically those from the era Greg had documented. At the top of her request sat the name Douglas Kenton. However, when authorities attempted to locate Kenton for questioning, they discovered a strange footnote buried within civil records. Kenton had died in 2019, listed as the sole victim of a single-vehicle crash on a rural road outside Missoula, Montana. There had been no passengers, no nearby witnesses, and the toxicology report, though filed, was never followed up. The report noted the brakes had failed, but the vehicle had been serviced just 2 weeks prior. The file had been closed within a month, deemed non-suspicious at the time due to Kenton's extensive business debts and possible distraction due to personal stress. Carla's instincts told her otherwise. She had read enough from Greg's notebook to understand the implication. Someone, perhaps Kenton himself, had been running out of room to hide, and perhaps someone had made sure his story ended before anyone could ask real questions. With Kenton dead, and Greg unwilling or unable to provide further names, the path forward seemed to collapse under its own weight. Carol returned to Pleasant Pines one last time, not to question, but to observe. Greg had been moved to the memory care wing, his stroke leaving him even more fragile, less lucid. On that final visit, as she sat quietly across from him while he dozed in his chair, she noticed something she hadn't before. Among the shelf of donated books beside his bed stood a worn King James Bible, spine cracked from youth. She pulled it down, curious more from instinct than expectation. As she flipped through the pages, a thin piece of folded paper fell from the back cover, wedged beneath the final binding seam. It was yellowed, fragile, torn unevenly at the edges. The handwriting was small, rushed, written in pencil. "If you find us, please don't bring us back. We survived. That has to be enough." Carla stared at it for a long moment. The phrasing was deliberate. We survived. It wasn't just Melissa writing. It was the voice of a mother and daughter, or perhaps even all three of them, reaching from wherever they had fled to make one final request. She placed the paper gently in an evidence sleeve, but she knew in her heart she wouldn't use it as leverage. Not for exposure, not for trial. It was their choice to be left alone. The question now wasn't whether to continue pursuing justice, but whether justice, in this case, would truly serve anyone left behind. The local press began circling, drawn by whispers of a found pastor, secret ledgers, and a shadowy donor. Carla declined interviews. The official police statement was vague. New evidence has led to a reassessment of a historical missing persons case. Investigators have identified the subject and confirmed the survival of key individuals involved. No names, no photos, no mention of abuse. She didn't redact the truth, but she left it in the hands of those who had already risked everything to tell it. 2 weeks later, Greg passed away in his sleep, peacefully, with Marisol by his side. The death certificate listed him as Gregory Ethan Miller, age 73. The name Frank L. Martin was listed as an alias. There was no next of kin noted, no funeral was held. His ashes were placed in a small box, per his earlier request, and given to Carla, who kept them briefly before choosing a quiet spot beneath a tree outside the old Maple Cross church grounds. She buried the box without ceremony, marking it with a single stone. No name, just a hand-carved cross. Melissa and Emily were never formally located. No attempt was made to issue warrants. Carla submitted a final report, sealed and marked for archival review only, titled Survivor's Request for Anonymity. In it, she summarized what she had learned, that sometimes justice isn't a courtroom, but a long road walked quietly. That sometimes truth isn't what's spoken, but what's endured. In the end, no charges were filed. No one was arrested. But a story long buried had been told, not loudly, not to the world, but to someone willing to listen. And that, perhaps, was enough. If this story left you thinking, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life inspired mysteries. What part of the story shocked you the most? And where do you think Melissa and Emily are now? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let us know where in the world you're watching from.